If you are, walking through the ruins of an ancient civilization, maybe you're standing in the shadow of a crumbling Roman aqueduct, or looking at the half-buried foundation of some forgotten desert empire, your mind almost automatically reaches for the dramatic.
Oh, absolutely.
You want a movie script. You picture these invading barbarian hordes cresting the hill, or like a sudden catastrophic plague wiping out the population in a matter of days.
Right, because we've been completely conditioned by history books and Hollywood to look for the sudden stab wound.
Yeah.
We look for a singular cataclysmic event that brings the giant crashing down.
Exactly. But that's just not how it usually happens, is it?
No, not at all. It is just the human bias toward narrative climax. I mean, we crave a clear villain or, an unpredictable disaster because it absolves the society itself of responsibility.
Right. If a meteor hits you, you're just a victim of circumstance.
Exactly. But when you step out of the realm of dramatic storytelling and enter the world of structural sociology and systems engineering, that entire movie script evaporates.
It really does.
You realize very quickly that empires, nation-states, global superpowers, they do not usually die from sudden trauma. They die from chronic, unglamorous, terrible resource management.
Wow.
They die because their internal circulation simply grinds to a halt.
Which honestly completely reframes what we're doing today.
Yeah.
Welcome to a very specific, highly rigorous deep dive into the source material.
Yes.
And I want to say right up front, if you picked up this text expecting a theological discussion about angels, demons, or, religious sentimentality, you're going to be shocked by what we found.
Deeply shocked.
Today, we're examining an incredibly dense structural analysis of a foundational text on civilizational survival. Specifically, we're looking at Lecture 8 out of 8 on Surah Ar-Rum, focusing entirely on its closing section, from Ayat 48 to the end.
And the analyst we are studying treats this document not as a collection of mystical chants or prayers for the afterlife, but as a master blueprint of socio-economic mechanics.
Yeah, the premise of this analysis is that to understand why a civilization thrives or collapses, you can't look at its politicians.
Right.
You don't look at its folklore or its military parades. You have to look at the architecture of its resource circulation.
You have to map the inputs and outputs of its societal engine.
Exactly. And the source traces this macro conflict back to an allegory that most of the world dismisses as a religious myth, right? The story of Adam versus Iblis.
But the text strips away the mythology entirely.
Completely.
It frames this not as a supernatural battle, but as the ultimate eternal clash between two competing operational models for human organization.
So let's lay those two models out, because the contrast is stark. On one side, you have the Adam archetype.
Right.
In this analytical framework, this represents a rule-based, equitable system. It's an infrastructure bound by immutable permanent laws that are designed for the long-term regenerative thriving of the collective.
Yeah, it operates on mutual respect, systemic feedback, and structural integrity.
Right. It's the architect meticulously building a house that will stand for 10 generations.
And opposing that, you have the Iblis archetype. And the source uses a brilliant, really visceral analogy to describe this model.
Oh, the horse analogy.
Yes. It compares it to a young, arrogant rider jumping onto the back of a wild, unbroken horse.
With no saddle.
No saddle. There are no reins. The rider simply wraps a rough rope violently around the animal's snout and attempts to force it into submission through sheer brute strength and pain.
That image is terrifying, but it perfectly encapsulates the system it represents. That wild rider is tyranny.
Exactly.
It's hubris. It's the dictator, the colonial extraction force, the hyper-monopolistic hoarder. It's power acting entirely without restraint.
It's extracting maximum short-term value without any regard for the underlying laws of the environment or, the psychology of the people.
Or even the long-term survival of the system itself. It is pure linear extraction. And a system built on that model is mathematically doomed to collapse.
Because you cannot break a complex system through sheer force without eventually destroying the very vehicle you are trying to ride.
Right. The horse will either buck you off and break your neck, or it will just die of exhaustion underneath you.
Precisely. So, the core mission of this deep dive, the entire purpose of analyzing these final verses of the text, is to map out the alternative.
We are going to explode the sentimental, centuries-old myth of rain as a magical blessing.
Yes, we are going to decode the text's final, most complete model of what it calls the productive law.
Let's get right into the text itself. The source material begins by deconstructing verses 48 and 49. And on a surface reading, the imagery feels purely poetic.
Right. It describes wind-moving clouds, spreading them across the sky, splitting them apart, and eventually sending down rain to revive dead, barren land.
Now, for hundreds of years, traditionalists have read this and reacted with a kind of passive gratitude. They think, what a beautiful miracle.
The deity in the sky is in a generous mood today and has graciously granted us a favor.
Right. But the structural analysis we're following violently rejects that passive reading, doesn't it?
Completely. Treating the rain cycle as a capricious, emotional favor from a deity completely undermines the text's actual purpose.
The analyst steps in and reframes this entire passage. The text isn't writing poetry.
No. It is presenting the master blueprint of an automated thermodynamic machine.
It is laying out the ultimate physical example of a closed-loop, regenerative resource system. It operates with mathematical precision.
And it demands to be studied as an engineering schematic.
So let's study it as an engineering schematic. I want to break down the specific mechanics of this blueprint exactly as the source details them.
Let's do it.
Because when you look at it through the lens of modern thermodynamics, the parallels are just staggering. Let's look at step 1, evaporation and purification.
Okay.
The text points out that the sun acts upon the ocean water. But the source makes a very specific, crucial note here about the state of that raw material.
Right. The ocean water is incredibly bitter.
It's so saturated with salt, heavy metals, and toxic elements that drinking it in its raw state would literally split your tongue.
It is fundamentally incompatible with sustaining biological life on land.
Yeah, it's a lethal resource in its raw, stagnant state. If you were to flood a wheat field with ocean water,
You would salt the earth and kill the soil for a generation.
exactly. So how does the system handle this massive toxic reservoir? It applies localized thermal energy.
The sun acts as a planetary-scale, nuclear-powered desalination plant.
Wow. Yeah.
It doesn't just indiscriminately move the water, it filters it at the molecular level. It extracts the pure, distilled H2O molecules, elevating them, and leaves all the heavy, lethal, toxic elements behind in the basin.
I just want to pause and marvel at the sheer scale of the energy required to do that.
It's unfathomable.
If human beings tried to artificially boil and transport even a fraction of the Atlantic Ocean to water a continent, it would bankrupt the global economy in a week.
We simply don't have the energy output.
Yet this system does it silently, daily,
Yeah.
requiring zero human labor to initiate. It is a fully automated purification mechanism.
And then we move to step 2, suspension and transportation.
Right. You have this newly purified, distilled water. It doesn't just hover over the ocean.
The winds, these atmospheric pressure systems, carry this water suspended in the sky.
Which is an insane feat of natural engineering that we take completely for granted.
You are talking about millions of tons of liquid mass, a literal ocean in the sky, completely defying gravity.
Held in a delicate, shifting balance of temperature and pressure, moving thousands of miles across continents.
But the transportation isn't random.
No. And that brings us to step 3, distribution. The text describes the clouds being spread and split. The water isn't just dumped all at once in one location.
Right, which would cause catastrophic flooding and wash away all the topsoil.
Exactly. It is deployed exactly where the system's physical laws dictate. The thermal updrafts, the topography of the mountain ranges, the atmospheric pressure differential.
They all act as a massive, automated computational network.
Wow. They calculate precisely where, when, and in what volume this purified resource needs to be delivered to trigger the next phase of life.
And notice what is missing from this entire cycle.
What's that?
There's no petitioning, there is no lobbying. The rain does not fall on the fields of a tyrant because he demanded it.
Right.
And it does not avoid the fields of the poor because they couldn't afford a bribe. The system is completely immune to human corruption.
It runs entirely by design, following immutable thermodynamic laws.
Yep.
It takes a toxic, stagnant pool, purifies it, elevates it, transports it across vast distances, and distributes it equitably across the land to maximize the generation of life.
Okay, let me stop you there because here's where the friction point emerges for me.
Okay, wait on me.
I am looking at this perfectly automated, perfectly circular system of nature. It's flawless. But if the universe operates on this perfectly circular, regenerative resource model, why does human history look like a graveyard of collapsed empires?
Right. Where is the disconnect?
Because human economic systems almost never act circularly. They act linearly.
We extract a raw resource from the earth, we exploit the labor to refine it, we consume it.
And then a tiny fraction of the population hoards the massive surplus in one localized place,
Yeah.
usually an offshore bank account or a corporate vault.
Meanwhile, the rest of the social soil literally dies of thirst.
And that disconnect is the central thesis of the entire source material. You've hit on the fatal contradiction.
Wow.
You cannot have a localized human economic system operating linearly extracting and hoarding while trying to survive inside a macro universe that operates circularly and demands continuous distribution.
It's a violation of the host environment's physics.
Exactly. Eventually, the friction between those two fundamentally incompatible models will tear the human system apart.
If human society acts like a clot in the planetary circulatory system,
The macro environment will simply reject the anomaly. It will crush the human system to restore the flow.
which forces us to look much closer at the language the text uses to describe this flow. We need to decode verse 50.
Let's do it.
The verse translates roughly to, "Look at the effects of God's mercy, how the earth is revived after its death." Now, if I am reading this as a 19th century poet, mercy is an emotion.
Right. It's a feeling of pity from a higher power.
But we are reading this as structural engineers. What does the original Arabic word ramat actually mean in the context of this thermodynamic machine?
Well, in the structural reading provided by the analyst, Ramat has absolutely nothing to do with emotion or sentiment. A system does not feel pity.
Gravity doesn't feel sorry for you when you fall off a building.
Exactly. Ramat is defined in this framework as a distributed resource delivery system.
A distributed resource delivery system.
Yes. It is the provision of every single element required for a biological, psychological, or social entity to reach its full developmental potential.
So when the text issues the directive, look at the effects of ramat, it isn't saying, look how kind the universe is.
Not at all. It is issuing an empirical command. Observe the physical outputs of this automated resource distribution network.
And the specific output it points to is the revival of dead Earth. This is crucial. We had to strip away all the religious baggage from the concept of resurrection here.
Right. Reviving dead Earth in this verse is not a poetic metaphor to make you feel less anxious about your own mortality.
It is a literal, observable proof of concept for the systemic principle of resurrection.
Yes. The source insists on this. In a socio-economic context, death is simply a state of halted circulation.
Like if you wrap a tourniquet around your arm and cut off the circulation of blood.
The cells in that arm will die. The physical matter is still there, but the operational life is gone.
And you can apply that directly to a society. If you cut off the circulation of capital, if you cut off access to food, education, technological innovation, or just basic human opportunity,
You produce a dead economy.
the skyscrapers might still be standing, the highways are still paved, but the system is functionally deceased.
The streets are filled with people who have no upward mobility, no regenerative energy.
Exactly. And the revival of the barren earth by the rain is the empirical proof that if you restore the circulation of vital resources, life inevitably returns.
It is not magic. It is cause and effect. You introduce the missing variables into the equation, and the system boots back up.
But wait, I have to challenge this, because if we stop the analysis there, it sounds like humans are just passive recipients.
Right. It sounds like we just sit in the dirt and wait for the economic rain to fall.
And the source text explicitly introduces a massive caveat here: the human variable. The text calls it rafakat, which the analyst translates as systemic partnership.
It is the ultimate dependency clause in the contract.
Let's use the source's analogy of the farmer to break this down. The macro system, the natural law, provides the incredible raw materials.
Right. It provides the solar radiation, the automated desalination, the aerial transportation, the nitrogen in the soil.
It delivers the rain. But what happens if that perfectly engineered rain falls on the field of a farmer who decides to stay in bed for 6 months?
Functionally, nothing productive happens. The soil gets wet. Weeds might grow.
But the targeted, high-yield, life-sustaining crop does not materialize.
Exactly. The macro system is necessary, but it is not sufficient on its own to produce human civilization. It demands strict alignment from the human element.
The rain is merely potential energy.
Yes. It requires the active, highly organized, aligned labor of the human being to convert that atmospheric potential into kinetic survival.
I really want to dive deep into the psychology of this farmer, because the source spends a significant amount of time redefining a word we hear constantly in cultural discourse: iman.
Oh, this is a huge paradigm shift.
Because if you ask 100 people on the street what iman means, 99 of them will tell you it means faith. They will describe it as a mystical, internal belief in the unseen.
But the source frames it entirely differently. It frames Iman as a concrete socio-economic behavior.
Let's look at the reality of the farmer's life. Why does a farmer willingly subject himself to brutal physical labor for 6 straight months?
Right. There is no daily paycheck. There is no corporate HR department guaranteeing his salary.
In fact, think about the moment of planting. The farmer might take his very last bag of wheat, the only food his family has left to survive the winter, and he deliberately buries it in the cold dirt.
From the perspective of pure short-term survival, burying your last meal in the mud is an act of sheer insanity.
It's an immense psychological and financial risk. So why does he do it?
He does it because he possesses Iman. But in this analytical framework, Iman is not a blind, desperate wish.
What is it then?
It is absolute, calculated trust in the productive law of the system. The farmer is acting on empirical observation and systemic understanding.
Right. He knows that the laws of biology and thermodynamics are permanent.
He knows that if he aligns his physical labor with those immutable laws, the system is obligated to respond.
He has calculated that sacrificing one seed today and mixing it with his aligned labor and the system's resources will yield a harvest of 700 seeds tomorrow.
It's an investment strategy based on the physics of the universe.
Wow. Yeah, he's gambling at a casino. He's engaging in a guaranteed contract. He knows the system's rules cannot be altered by a bad mood or a bribe.
And the source argues that this specific type of certainty, this Iman, is the sole engine of human progress.
The soul engine.
Yes. It is the only psychological mechanism that allows a human being to override their primal instinct for immediate gratification.
Because without that absolute calculated trust in the stability of the system's laws, no human would ever plant a seed.
They would never build a university. They'd never conduct a decade-long scientific experiment.
They would just eat the last bag of wheat today and wait to die tomorrow.
Exactly. And this completely changes the definition of divine help, or what the text calls nusrat.
Usually people treat divine help like a magic spell. My economy is collapsing, my institutions are corrupt, let me say a chant and wait for a supernatural bailout.
But the source is saying nusrat doesn't work like that. It is a strict, unyielding partnership.
The immutable universal law provides the baseline mechanics, the environment, the raw materials.
And the human being must provide the aligned, intelligent, persistent labor. Both variables are absolutely required.
If either variable is a zero, the output of the entire equation is zero.
Which brings us to the most controversial and perhaps the most intellectually challenging part of this deep dive.
Okay, buckle up.
If the universe operates on this permanent natural law, this strict partnership of aligned labor and equitable resource distribution, how do human-made economic models measure up?
Right. The source material takes a very sharp turn here into historical analysis. It explicitly compares this natural blueprint with the dominant political and economic systems of the 20th century.
Now, I need to pause here and speak directly to you, the listener. We are about to discuss highly charged political ideologies.
Yes, we need to be crystal clear. We are maintaining strict journalistic impartiality here. We're not taking sides.
We are not endorsing any modern political party, and we are not attacking one. We are simply reporting, with as much accuracy as possible, the source text's sociological and systemic critique of these historical models.
That context is vital, because the source looks at the grand experiments of the 20th century, specifically focusing on Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism, and it analyzes them not as evil empires, but as flawed attempts to engineer a functional society.
And it starts with a fascinating structural teardown of the foundational flaw in early communist ideology.
Let's be honest, the original ideal of Marxism was conceptually beautiful. It was summarized in that famous, incredibly appealing maxim, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs.
On paper, if you are designing a society from scratch, that sounds perfectly equitable.
But the source notes that the architect of this system quickly realized there was a fatal, gaping hole in the human equation.
The human incentive problem.
Right.
The architect realized that humans are not cogs in a machine. They are psychological entities. Let's play this out. You tell a worker that he must labor tirelessly.
He must exhaust his physical and mental capacity to produce a massive surplus of goods for the state.
But at the end of the day, he must surrender 100% of that surplus to the Central Committee, and he will only be given back the bare minimum required for his survival, his needs.
The psychological wall you hit is immediate. Why would he do it?
Exactly. What is the incentive for a human being to continually produce a massive surplus if they do not benefit from the overflow?
If the system guarantees my basic survival needs, regardless of how hard I work, and it caps my rewards regardless of how much extra I produce. My logical, rational response is to do the absolute bare minimum required to not get arrested.
The system lacked a psychological engine, and the source argues that human-made, purely materialist ideologies constantly run into this wall.
When the psychological incentive fails, the system only has two options. It either stagnates and collapses from lack of production.
Or the state has to introduce a new incentive. Terror.
Well, yeah.
It has to rely on brute force, secret police, and labor camps to extract the necessary surplus. It turns into the wild rider on the horse.
But here is where the source text does something phenomenal. It doesn't just point out the flaw of the Marxist model and declare capitalism the victor.
Not at all. It brings in the text's own profound answer to this dilemma, referencing another section of the foundational document, Surah al-Waqi'ah.
It asks, how does the natural immutable law solve the problem of who owns the surplus?
And it solves it by completely redefining the concept of ownership itself.
I have to admit, when I first read this section of the source material, it broke my brain a little bit.
Oh, same here.
Because my initial reaction was to defend the capitalist model. Let's go back to our farmer. I buy the plot of land, I buy the tractor, I purchase the genetically modified seeds. I wake up at 4 a.m. every single day, I toil in the sun, I harvest the wheat.
Right, the classic self-made narrative.
Exactly. From a modern economic standpoint, I say, I grew this wheat, my capital and my labor produced it, therefore 100% of the surplus belongs to me.
I have the right to hoard it in a silo.
I have the right to sell it at a 500% markup during a famine, or I can literally burn it to artificially manipulate market prices. That is the baseline of modern economics. How does the text challenge that?
The system challenges it by asking a series of incredibly aggressive structural questions. It essentially puts the farmer on the witness stand and cross-examines his claim of absolute ownership.
Okay, let's hear the cross-examination.
The system asks, did you invent thermodynamics?
No.
Did you build the automated desalination plant in the ocean that purified the toxic water? Did you engineer the atmospheric pressure differentials that transported that water thousands of miles to your specific field?
Obviously not.
Did you formulate the complex biochemistry of the soil? Did you write the DNA code inside the seed that tells it how to convert solar radiation into physical matter?
Okay, I see where this is going.
The source argues that when you actually calculate the energy expenditure required to produce a single grain of wheat, the human being's contribution, their physical labor and their little tractor, is statistically microscopic.
It's a fraction of a percent of the total energy involved.
The vast, overwhelming majority of the productive input comes from the macro system. The universe provided the heavy lifting.
And so the mathematical conclusion drawn by the text is devastating to absolute private hoarding. The system dictates that the farmer only genuinely owns the equivalent of his labor.
He owns what he put in.
The massive compound surplus generated by the harvest does not belong to him. It belongs to the system that provided the 99% of the raw materials and energy.
And in practical socio-economic terms, what does it mean to return the surplus to the system?
It means distributing it. It means pushing the excess resources into the gaps in the social fabric, to the marginalized, the incapacitated, the infrastructure, to keep the circulation moving.
It is the rain cycle applied to economics.
The source takes it a step further. Claiming 100% ownership of the surplus and hoarding it for oneself is categorized in the text as kufr.
Now, again, we have to strip away the cultural translation here.
Right. Traditionally, kufr is translated as religious disbelief or infidelity. But the source goes back to the absolute linguistic root of the word.
Which means to cover up or to conceal.
The hoarder is not just being greedy. They are committing a systemic lie. They are literally covering up the truth of the system.
They're concealing the undeniable fact that the universe did 99% of the work, and they're falsely claiming the credit to justify their hoarding.
It is a society built on a fraudulent ledger, and a system built on a lie cannot achieve permanence. Which brings the source to its next major critique of human political ideologies, the devastating problem of fluctuation versus permanence.
Let's get into this because the text contrasts the shifting arbitrary rules of human history with the concept of wahi.
Wahi is another heavily loaded word. Traditionally, it just means revelation, like a voice speaking from the clouds.
But the analyst defines it systemically as immutable foundational law. It uses a specific, uncompromising phrase, la mubadila li kalimati.
Meaning there is no altering his words.
In engineering terms, the core operating parameters of the universe cannot be hacked, bribed, or patched.
And the source immediately contrasts this immutable permanence with historical examples, returning to Lenin, Mao, and we could even add modern boom and bust financial cycles.
Think about living in those mid-20th century authoritarian systems.
Yeah.
The rules of the game changed overnight based on the paranoia of a dictator or a secret meeting of a central committee.
You could be a decorated hero in the state, an absolute champion of the working class on Tuesday.
But by Wednesday morning, the 5-year plan changes, the political winds shift, and you are declared an enemy of the revolution and shipped off to a frozen labor camp in Siberia.
How can any society function with that level of chronic anxiety?
It can't.
If I don't know what the rules will be tomorrow, if the currency might be devalued overnight, if my property might be seized without cause, if the legal definition of a crime changes retroactively, I cannot plan for the future.
You cannot have Iman. That calculated trust we spent so much time discussing is impossible to maintain.
It's entirely impossible. A system can only offer genuine psychological security and a real incentive to labor if its core laws are permanent.
If the laws can be rigged by the wealthy, suspended by tyrants in a state of emergency, or altered by a corrupt bureaucracy, the system is fundamentally unstable.
The text insists that true human freedom is not the absence of rules. It is only possible when society is governed by immutable laws that apply equally to the dictator and the street sweeper.
Laws that no human being has the authority or the power to change.
That is a brilliant transition into segment 4, the engine of reason and the tyranny of unproven assertions. We are looking at verse 51 now.
Okay, let's hear it.
The text says, "And if we sent a wind, and they saw their crops turn yellow, they would remain thereafter disbelievers."
This is perhaps the most devastating critique of human cognitive dissonance in the entire text.
Let's break it down.
The source provides a meticulous structural analysis of this verse. We just established that the system operates on permanent, immutable laws. But what happens when those exact same laws produce a bad cycle?
What happens when, instead of the life-giving rain, the atmospheric pressure shifts, a dry, scorching wind blows in, and the crops turn yellow and die?
Well, historically, we know exactly what happens. The source points out that the very same people who were praising the system yesterday when it gave them rain suddenly reject the entire system today.
They throw their hands up, curse the sky, and say, the system is broken, the universe is fundamentally malicious and unfair.
It is the ultimate failure of selective data reading. It is a profoundly unscientific approach to reality.
Let me introduce an analogy here because it's like a software developer.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine a programmer writes a complex piece of code. It runs perfectly for a month, outputting exactly what it should. Then one day, the user inputs a specific set of conflicting variables, and the software throws a massive error code and crashes.
Right.
A rational scientific developer doesn't smash their monitor with a hammer. They don't scream that computer science is a lie and that the microchips hate them.
No, they read the error code as vital system feedback. They debug. They look at the inputs to see what caused the negative output.
The source uses a similar logic, akin to an airplane pilot.
Yes, the airplane analogy is great. Imagine you were flying a commercial 747 at 30,000 feet. Suddenly, a red warning light starts flashing aggressively on the dashboard. Cabin pressure is dropping.
A scientific pilot doesn't ignore the light.
They don't blame the passengers or claim the airplane is cursed. They read that flashing red light as data.
The system is telling them, you are out of alignment with the required parameters for survival. You need to descend immediately to correct your course.
But civilizations constantly act like the irrational pilot. The source notes that when human societies experience positive economic outputs, a booming stock market, a massive harvest, unprecedented technological breakthroughs, they never attribute it to the macro system.
Never. They accept it as a gift. Or worse, they attribute it entirely to their own personal genius. Look how brilliant we are. Look at our incredible monetary policy. Look at our superior culture.
But when the negative outputs arrive, when the crops inevitably turn yellow, when the housing market collapses, when inflation skyrockets, or when social unrest explodes in the streets, they absolutely refuse to read it as feedback.
They blame it on random bad luck. They blame foreign enemies, they blame minority groups, or they adopt a posture of fatalism and say human nature is just doomed.
The scientific method of civilization, as demanded by the source text, requires acknowledging both sides of the dataset. A yellow, dying crop is not a random punishment from an angry god.
It is the strict physical consequence of specific thermodynamic or ecological variables.
And economic depression is not a mysterious curse. It is the mathematical, inevitable result of prolonged hoarding, wealth inequality, and halted circulation.
If a society cannot read its negative data objectively, if it cannot look at its own yellow crops and say, we inputted the wrong variables, it is doomed to repeat the crash.
And that collective inability to read systemic feedback is exactly what drives a civilization into the ground. This leads us directly into segment 5, the law of requital, or in the source's original terminology, mukafati amal, the systemic feedback loop.
We're diving into verses 52 through 54 now.
Okay.
The text here uses some very stark, almost brutal imagery. It states unequivocally that you cannot make the dead hear. You cannot make the deaf hear if they turn their backs, and you cannot guide the blind.
Now, again, if you're reading this on a superficial level, it sounds discriminatory, but the source is adamant. We must strip away the literal, physical interpretation.
Right. These verses are not describing physical or biological disabilities in human beings.
Not at all. The analyst argues that these are functional states of a system. They are diagnostic categories.
The text is providing a medical chart for a society that has fallen dangerously out of alignment with the productive law. Let's break down these states of terminal misalignment. First, the dead. What does it mean for a society to be dead?
A dead system is one with absolute zero regenerative energy left. It has completely exhausted its resources, its political institutions are entirely corrupt and calcified, and there is absolutely no circulation of fresh ideas, capital, or opportunity.
It is thermodynamically inert.
Mhm.
You cannot speak reason to a dead system. You cannot reform it from the inside because it lacks the basic capacity to process input. It's a corpse waiting to be buried by history.
Then you have the deaf. A deaf system is one that cannot process external feedback. It is functionally deaf to the data.
I want to apply this to the real world. Look at the corporate world. Look at Blockbuster Video in the early 2000s.
Oh, perfect example.
Or look at the lead up to the 2008 global financial crash. You had these massive, powerful systems, corporate boards, regulatory agencies, central banks, but their leadership was entirely surrounded by yes men and insulated echo chambers.
The sensors were broken. The data was there. People were warning about subprime mortgages for years. But the internal reporting only allowed positive metrics to reach the top.
The system could not hear the warning alarms of its own impending collapse.
That is a perfect modern translation. Next is the blind. A blind society is one that cannot read its environment accurately. It cannot spot incoming crises.
It might actually have the raw data coming in, but it completely lacks the vision, the historical context, or the analytical framework to understand what the data means.
It is driving at 150 miles an hour toward a cliff, completely unaware of the topography.
But the final category the text outlines is the most damning. It specifies the deaf who turn their backs.
This is the ultimate, unforgivable systemic failure.
This is a society that has functioning sensors. It hears the alarm bells ringing. It clearly sees the cliff rapidly approaching.
It recognizes the corrective signal, and it deliberately, consciously chooses to ignore it in order to maintain the comfort of the status quo.
It is the fossil fuel executive reading the internal, scientifically accurate climate change report in the 1970s, realizing exactly what the carbon output will do to the global temperature.
And actively choosing to bury the report to protect the next 40 years of quarterly profits.
It is recognizing the absolute truth of the systemic feedback and actively turning away.
And the text warns that the law of requital, the systemic feedback loop, is merciless here. If a system continuously ignores the feedback doesn't just stop.
The universe doesn't give up.
The feedback intensifies. The friction grows hotter and hotter until it either forces a massive, painful correction or it violently destroys the non-responding element. You cannot negotiate with physics.
Which leads directly to the source's analysis of the arc of civilizational entropy in verse 54. The text describes a progression: weakness, then strength, then a return to weakness.
The analyst argues this is the natural arc of any physical entity, a human body, a main sequence star, or a global empire.
It's the life cycle of a civilization. Let's trace it. A society usually starts out in a state of weakness or infancy. Because it is weak, it is hungry.
It is innovative. It is forced to align with the productive laws out of sheer survival necessity.
It cooperates, it circulates resources efficiently, and because of that alignment, it builds immense strength. It reaches its peak. It enters its golden age.
But then the psychology shifts. The society gets comfortable. The elites start believing that their strength is inherent to their bloodline or their culture, rather than a byproduct of their alignment with the system's laws.
They stop investing in the regenerative cycle. They start hoarding the massive surplus. They build higher walls instead of longer aqueducts.
And without continuous, active, strenuous alignment to the regenerative law, that slide into the final stage of weakness is mathematically guaranteed.
Entropy always wins if you stop putting fresh, aligned energy into a system.
And the source points out a deeply ironic, almost tragic historical pattern here. When these bloated, hoarding civilizations finally hit the wall, when the empire crumbles under its own weight or the economy completely collapses, their leaders almost always cry foul.
They stand in the ruins and complain, "We weren't given enough time. It happened so incredibly fast. No one warned us this could happen."
But the text rejects that excuse entirely. The analyst points out that the data was there all along, the yellow crops were there, the staggering wealth inequality was there.
The social friction and the crumbling infrastructure were there.
The immutable laws of the system were screaming at them for decades. They just acted like the deaf system turning its back. They chose the luxurious comfort of the status quo over the incredibly hard, disruptive work of systemic correction.
Okay, we need to unpack this final major concept in segment 6 because this is where the source does its heaviest lifting. It completely re-engineers a massive theological term, Ba'ath.
Usually, this is translated as resurrection or the day of awakening.
Yes. For centuries, across multiple traditions, this concept has been interpreted purely as an eschatological post-mortem event. The imagery is dead bodies physically rising from their graves at the end of time when a trumpet blows.
But the source material, relying on a very strict forensic linguistic analysis, explores its structural socio-economic meaning.
The root Arabic word of Ba'ath literally means to remove obstacles from the path.
To remove obstacles from the path. Think about how radically that changes the paradigm.
It's not just a mystical event waiting at the end of the universe. It is a historical and systemic inevitability happening right now.
The source explains that when oppressive human systems, whether they are absolute monarchs, hyper-capitalist cartels hoarding the water supply, or deeply corrupt bureaucracies entrench themselves, they become literal blockages.
They block human progress. They hoard the resources. They halt the vital circulation of the society, and they slowly choke the life out of the population.
And because these entities hold all the immediate material power, the military, the banks, the media, they mistakenly believe they are permanent fixtures.
They look at their fortresses and think they are as immovable as the mountains.
But Ba'ath, in the context of human history and sociology, is the inevitable systemic revolution. It is the moment when the underlying immutable laws of physics, economics, and human psychology build up so much suppressed pressure that they sweep these artificial human obstacles away.
It's the physics of a dam breaking. If you build a concrete dam across a massive, flowing river, you can hold the water back for a while. You can enjoy the artificial reservoir you've created.
But if you don't release the pressure, if the circulation is blocked for too long, the system doesn't just quietly dry up and die.
The pressure builds exponentially until the dam violently ruptures. That rupture, that explosive clearing of the blockages, allows humanity to rise again.
It allows the resources to circulate freely again. That rupture is the historical resurrection.
And knowing that this rupture, this bath, is coming, the text gives final, vital directives to the vanguard.
The vanguard being the individuals, the analysts, the groups who understand the systemic laws and are actively trying to align society with the productive law before the catastrophic collapse happens.
Right. And the key instruction given to this vanguard is istiqamat.
Istiqamat is usually translated as steadfastness or perseverance, but the source frames it with a brilliant practical edge. Do not let them see you sweat.
Think about it. When you are a vanguard pushing back against a massive, deeply entrenched, corrupt system, the pushback you receive will be immense.
You will face state propaganda. You will face total economic blacklisting. You might face severe physical threats. The friction will be nearly unbearable.
But the directive is clear. Do not make a single move. Do not flinch. Do not offer a single compromise that suggests to the broken system that you doubt the immutable laws.
Because the moment the broken system, the hoarding elites, the wild writers senses that you doubt your own data, the moment they sense that you doubt the ultimate inevitability of the laws of regeneration, they will crush you.
Istiqamat is maintaining absolute, unyielding structural integrity under maximum external pressure.
But let's play this out to the best case scenario. Let's say the vanguard succeeds.
Okay, The pressure builds, the obstacles removed, the systemic revolution is successful, and society is finally realigned with the regenerative law.
The resources are flowing, the metaphorical crops are green. What happens then?
The source points out a fatal human psychological flaw that always emerges at this exact moment: the belief that success is the finish line.
The source quotes a cultural phrase here. Ravi Aish, Likta Hai. The narrator writes of luxury. It is the classic fairy tale ending. The evil king was defeated, the good people took over, and they lived happily ever after.
The text violently rejects this narrative. When the system is finally functioning equitably, when the circulation is healthy, that is not the time to lay down your tools and rest.
That is precisely when the real grueling work begins.
Because entropy never, ever sleeps. If you build a perfect machine and then stop maintaining it, it immediately begins to rust and decay.
The moment of victory is actually the most dangerous moment in a civilization's life cycle because it instantly breeds complacency. The text demands continuous, agonizing effort and introduces a final concept to manage this.
Tauba. And here we have our final major redefinition. Tauba is universally translated in religious contexts as repentance.
The image is someone sitting in a dark room, weeping, feeling intense guilt, and asking a deity for forgiveness for their sins.
But the source clarifies that in this structural framework, Tauba is not an emotional ritual. It is a navigational course correction.
Let's modernize the analogy. Think of it like a GPS navigation system in your car.
You type in your destination, a perfectly aligned, equitable society. You are driving along, and you make a wrong turn. You start heading toward hoarding or corruption.
The GPS doesn't yell at you. It doesn't ask you to pull over and cry about your mistake. It immediately says rerouting.
Tauba is the physical act of grabbing the steering wheel and turning the car back onto the correct heading the very second you realize you are off course.
It is an action, not an emotion. The moment a system or an individual realizes it has taken a wrong step, that a policy is creating inequality, that a resource is being poorly managed, it pivots.
It doesn't wallow in paralyzing guilt. It executes a functional mathematical correction.
And the source makes a profoundly beautiful systemic observation about the responsiveness of the macro environment here. When the human element executes Tauba, when it takes one active step back toward alignment with the productive law, the system rushes 2 steps forward to meet it.
I love that. The system is designed to reward alignment. It wants you to succeed.
If a society stops hoarding, if it actively starts circulating its surplus, the economy doesn't just recover linearly, it compounds.
The dead soil regenerates faster than the models predict. Societal trust rebuilds exponentially. The overarching system of the universe is inherently biased toward life, provided you play by its rules.
So if we pull all of this together, and this brings us to our grand synthesis, we have to zoom out and look at the entire massive arc of this source material, Surah Ar-Rum.
It truly is a masterpiece of structural framing. The analyst points out a beautiful symmetry. Lecture 1 of this series opened by analyzing the grand clashes of human empires, specifically Rome and Persia.
It tracked their massive geopolitical wars, their rise and fall, using the immutable laws of history. It analyzed armies, macroeconomies, and political power hubs.
And now, here at the very end in Lecture 8, it closes the text not with a discussion of emperors or military strategy, but with the rain cycle.
It presents evaporation, wind suspension, and precipitation as the master model of the productive law.
It is sending a profound message. It is telling us that the specific economic channels, the specific technologies, the currencies we use, whether it's Roman gold coins in antiquity, Persian silk trade routes, or modern digital algorithms and high-frequency trading, those superficial things constantly fluctuate and change across eras.
But the regenerative architecture underneath them is absolutely constant.
Verses 48 to the end serve as the ultimate proof that the macro law governing the chaotic rise and fall of human history is the exact same thermodynamic law that governs the physical world.
There is no separation between sociology and physics. There is only one law. Regeneration occurs through aligned circulation. If the wind moves, clouds form, water distributes, and dead land revives.
And the inverse is true. If you cut the circulation, the system dies. If you restore it, the system lives. It is fundamental cause and effect, played out on a civilizational scale.
Which leaves us with a critical, urgent lens through which to view our own reality today.
Exactly. We have spent the last hour breaking down the perfect, closed-loop system of the natural world, a system where every single drop of toxic water is accounted for, purified, elevated, and redistributed equitably to sustain the maximum amount of life.
Now, I want you to take that perfect blueprint and lay it over the data points of our own modern, hyper-globalized society.
Look at the global wealth distribution. Look at the fragility of our supply chains. Look at the staggering ecological degradation. Ask yourself, are we the farmer, possessing Iman, trusting the system, aligning our labor with the immutable laws of regeneration, and ensuring the surplus flows back into the soil to nourish the future?
Or are we the deaf system? Are we sitting on unprecedented mountains of hoarded resources, ignoring the flashing red warning lights on the planetary dashboard, and deliberately turning our backs to the approaching storm?
Because the text makes one thing clear. The storm is not a punishment. It is just the system rebalancing itself. The only question left is whether we will be a part of the restored circulation or an obstacle that gets washed away.
A profound and slightly terrifying question to leave you with.
Thank you for joining us on this incredibly deep dive into the source material. Until next time, keep analyzing the systems around you.